have left now, and I say all, is to hook up a lot of cables to everything. Let me just run through a little list. If we get sick, or if I feel like the watchers are going to get sick of watching all this cable hooking up, we'll stop the video. But let me just give you an overview of a kind of a checklist of things we have to do to get this finalized. I know it's going to be boring to watch me hook all this stuff up. The one thing you have to do is, you know, all these front panel things that are on computers, like the power button and these USB slots and the headphone jacks and all that. Well, you have to connect those to the motherboard, and all those cables are back here with those zip ties we saw before. So we have to hook all these things into the motherboard. Now usually there is a little set of pins on the motherboard that you have to hook cables into individually. This little header helps you hook all these little cables into this header, and then you can just plug this whole thing into the motherboard at once. So this makes things a little bit easier to hook all that front panel connectors up. Another thing we have to do is supply power to some of the components. So we have to provide power to the motherboard, and there are two connectors for the motherboard power, a long one here, and then a smaller one right up here in this little corner that's a little hard to see. We also have to plug the fans in. So this fan that cools the processor we have to hook up. There's also an exhaust fan here in the case. We have to hook that into the motherboard, so these get their power from the motherboard. And also the motherboard controls how fast these fans spin. They're adjustable. So this fan, there are also two fans in the front of the case that pull air in. This exhaust fan sucks warm air out the top back. So we have to provide power to all those. So all the fans connect to the motherboard, and there are a lot of little connectors on the motherboard that will be labeled fan. Some will say cha fan, that means chassis fan, so for the case fan. I'm looking for the one that says CPU fan. CPU fan is up here on top. But just look at your motherboard manual or read the tiny lettering on the motherboard, and that'll tell you where to plug in these little 4-pin connectors. Two of them provide power for the fan. One of them sends a signal to the motherboard telling the motherboard how fast the fan is spinning. And the other little wire is a signal where the motherboard can tell the fan to go faster or slower. So 4 pins. Also, we have to provide power to the GPU. There's a little 6-pin connector here for the GPU. We also have to provide power to the hard drive and the SSD. And also we have to hook another cable up so that the hard drive and the SSD can communicate with the motherboard. And the motherboard this motherboard comes with 3 cables for hooking up hard drives and SSDs. They're the same. The only difference is that some of the cables will have a little right angle connector, and some of them will be straight. Just depends on whether you need to go up and then into a connector, or this one, if you can just go plug straight in. Sometimes you don't have the clearance to plug something in that way, and it's better to go up and plug in that way. So we're going to need 2 of these SATA cables, what they're called, and then we're going to need lots of power cables. So we have 1 power cable that gives power, that big power connector on the right here,
and the modular power supply. We have to find on the power line, and then this end goes to the motherboard. The motherboard, this case are these little rubber grommets. You can cables. think how this is going, but
just press them in until there's a little click. There's a little snap. There you go. I don't know if you heard that or not. There we go. I think that works. That works fine right there. And then we can thread it back through. There's another little grommet on the bottom, and then we can hook this end into the power supply, and we don't have those cables everywhere there. We also have a 6-pin power connector for the GPU here, and then we're going to have 2 smaller connectors, one for the hard drive and one for the SSD. And we're going to use the same cable since it has multiple. You can hook up to 4 here as long as the spacing is okay. And I checked and this one works. And again, one will go into this hard drive that we mounted in this nice little tray, and the other in the SSD. So as not to bore you to death, we'll hook up all these cables, and then we'll come back and we'll check to make sure everything's hooked up. Alright, so we hooked in the power supply cables into the power supply, and we hooked one up top like we said for the processor, this one for the other things on the motherboard, this one for the GPU, and one running around the back that goes into the hard drive, another one for the SSD. And we plugged in our cables and routed them through the back that let the SSD and the hard drive communicate with the motherboard right there. We saw those connections when we were looking at the motherboard. The next cables we have to deal with are all those things for the front panel audio, the power button, and all that kind of stuff we mentioned before. So we need to get this little header out here and plug all those in. And so they're labeled here. This one says HD audio. Let's take care of these little bitty ones and the USB ones. So the little bitty ones, like this one says reset switch. You just find the place on this little header that says reset, and you plug those 2 pins in there. So this helps wrangle all these other little pins. This says power switch. They go this way. Ground, reset. I was putting them long ways and they go flat ways. Okay. This one is the power switch. Power LED plus. Power LED minus. Big one there. Hard drive LED. And that's all the cables we're given. We'll figure out where that audio one goes on the motherboard. We'll have to look at the manual. And the other 2 front panel connectors we have to deal with here are for the USB ports. Now this blue one, blue usually indicates a USB 3.0, and it involves more pins than this little black one that is for the USB 2.0. So this case has 2 USB 2.0 ports, and there are usually several USB 2.0 headers. Both of these right here are USB 2.0 headers, and on the plug it has 9 pins with 1 blocked off. So you just need to look at the plug and figure out where the hole is that that little plugged off one will be able to fit. So it'll only go in one way. And I think I see that this one goes in that way. And then this USB 3.0 one is right next door here. And with this, there's a little hard to see blue notch. And that notch goes in a little slot on the bottom. So it will only go in one way, trying to help you put the right cable in the right hole and not reverse it. I'm going to get that lined up and in that hole. Alright, and that clicked in there. Now, we run through, we have to figure out where this goes, and this little connector, like I was saying, let me separate it. It goes up on the motherboard on the top. What's it doing down here on the bottom? So we're going to have to re-thread this through the back and then through the top. And then we'll look at the motherboard manual to see where the HD audio plug goes. We'll sort that out and then we'll come back. We're going to do a little last minute checklist here. We have installed all the parts, the CPU, the GPU, the power supply, the hard drive. We put the memory in there. We have separate power going to the GPU, to the CPU, to the motherboard. We have power going to the hard drive and the SSD. We also hooked up power to the fans. So there's a cooling fan in the back to exhaust warm air. There's a cooling fan blowing air in from the front. We hooked up power to those. And so it seems like everything has been hooked up that needs to be hooked up. So now the next step we want to do is to see if the computer posts. POST stands for Power On Self-Test. P-O-S-T. Power On Self-Test. That is the initial indication that everything's hooked up and kind of ready to go. It's not a guarantee that everything works. So we need to hook in the power cable into the power supply here. Let's put that into the wall. And then we have an HDMI cable that I'm going to plug into the HDMI out on the GPU. And we have this all running over to a TV. So we're going to press the power button. So we hooked up all the power buttons and all that kind of stuff. We found the plug for the audio connectors on the front and the USB and contact, and nothing happens, which is usually something that makes your heart sink into your stomach until you remember that you need to turn on this little power switch on the power supply itself. And now contact. We have a fan spinning here. The fan spun on the power supply for a second. The fan is spinning on the cooler. We have some little LED light action going from the motherboard there. There's a little white LED on the GPU, and that tells us that it's getting power. If there's a little red light on the GPU, that means that this power cable is not hooked up, but it's hooked to the motherboard. That seems good. There's a little blue LED here on the power button that seems like it's working. And then we go over to the TV over here. And this is a post screen. So this is called the BIOS, Basic Input Output System screen. It says who made the BIOS, etc. This is telling us that we're getting a signal to the TV. It tells us that the motherboard is basically hooked up, and it gives us some diagnostic information even though it's not on the screen quite right here. It says the memory is 16 gigabytes. Good. It says no drives are detected yet. One keyboard and one mouse. Yes, we hooked up a keyboard and a mouse. Oh, it did detect the drives. The Western Digital drive and the Samsung Evo drive. And it says something CPU installed. We don't know what it says over here. Please enter setup to configure your system. I'm thinking all this is good because it's seeing most of the stuff. It just wants to run an initial setup to help detect what devices and what CPU has been installed. Most of this is usually, oh, there it says, our CPU, i7-8700k. So all the stuff we put in there has been detected, it looks like. Except we're not guaranteed for the GPU, except for the fact that we just plugged the GPU into the TV. Everything seems okay so far. So let me grab my keyboard and I'm going to hit F1 to run setup as it is instructing me to do. And this takes you into a setup menu where you can see the fans that we have connected to the motherboard. This is the CPU fan. It tells us how fast it's running. This is the chassis fan that we hooked up to the motherboard. There's another one we didn't hook up directly to the motherboard. We just hooked some power into it. Maybe we'll route it to the motherboard later. But this is all looking very good. It's telling us the CPU voltage. It's telling us some temperatures here. And basically at this point what you want to do is read through your motherboard manual, and if there's anything you need to set up, set it up. However, most of this stuff is done automatically for you these days. What we could probably do here is there's this option here, it says F11 for Easy Tuning Wizard, and that will probably set up everything we need. We're going to go and hit that and run through that. If we run through any snags, we'll let you know. But otherwise, this is good to go for now. All we need to do is maybe run this setup, exit out, reboot, and then the next step is going to be to install Windows. And I will come back with another section in just a moment and show you how to do that, show you what I did.